A warm welcome to all of you lovers of New York City and of literature who are gathered today to honor and celebrate the life and work of Sinclair Lewis, the first American author to win a Nobel Prize in Literature. I'm Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel, the chair of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center and the New York City Landmarks 50 Alliance. The Alliance is a committee of 131 organizations, and still growing, of distinguished and dedicated individuals and organizations committed to informing the public about the past, present, and future of historic preservation in New York City. We thank George Kapsis, the owner of 69 Charles Street, Simeon Bankoff, the executive director of the Historic Districts Council. There are 111 as of last week historic districts in New York City and 20 extensions, and Simeon and his organization are the citywide advocates for all historic districts, including this one. And to Deborah Burchad, who assisted with the approvals, the installation, and oversees this program. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to you all for coming as well. And now to Sinclair Lewis, a novelist, playwright, and short story writer. Sinclair Lewis began his career in Sauk Center, Minnesota as a sensitive, introspective romantic. He entered Yale University in 1903, and his earliest published works appear in the Yale Literary Magazine. He took time off to work at Upton Sinclair's commune in Englewood, New Jersey, and to travel to Panama. As a result, he did not receive his degree from Yale until 1908. After college, Lewis turned out what are frequently described as potboilers and popular stories to make ends meet. But while here in New York, and when he lived at 69 Charles Street from 1910 to 1913, he worked in New York City publishing houses as a copywriter and as an editor. It was not until 1914 that he produced his first serious novel, and in July 1920, he finished his well-known and runaway bestseller, Main Street. His other novels, Babbitt, Elmer Gantry, Dodsworth, marked him as one of the foremost realists of the early 20th century, capturing the irony and pathos of middle-class, middle America. After winning the Nobel Prize in 1930, he wrote 11 more novels, including It Can't Happen Here, which envisions fascism coming to America. A member of the National Institute of Arts and Letters and the American Academy of Arts and Letters, he continued to be a prolific writer, but alas, none of his later writings equal the success or stature of his significant writings of the 20s. After his divorce from his second wife in 1942, Sinclair Lewis lived chiefly in Europe. From Main Street to Stockholm, Letters of Sinclair Lewis, 1919-1930, was published in 1952, 1 year after his death in Rome. And now, there are genuine authorities who have joined us this morning, and they will tell you about the work of Sinclair Lewis. George Kapsis, the longtime homeowner of 69 Charles Street, is publisher and editor of Westview News. It was at his request, in fact his insistence if you know him, and his approval that this medallion to Sinclair Lewis was created. Mr. Tapsis will now say a few words.
I teased Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel outrageously, right?
I would not use that description. Please, a few words.
When I bought this house 50 years ago, I had no idea that Sinclair Lewis worked and lived in this building. But one day, I was sitting at my desk and I saw a group of students with a professor lecturing them, and I ran out and I said, "Why are you looking at my house? And why are you pointing at my house?" And the professor said, "Sinclair Lewis lived in this building." That was a great shock to me. Now, I went out and I got a biography of Sinclair Lewis. I riffled through the pages and I discovered finally one page. It's only maybe half the page. Sinclair Lewis at 69 Charles Street. Now, he was living here with two other writers. One was the brother of Stephen Vincent Benet. The other, I forget his name, but evidently he disappeared in literary history. But they were very poor. Sinclair Lewis made $13 a week as a copy boy, I guess, for a publishing house. And they treated themselves every Sunday by going to the Brevoort Hotel. Now, only you people who are over 50 will remember the Brevoort Hotel, but it used to be a great hotel which was on 11th Street and 5th Avenue, and it had one of the rare outdoor cafes. You people who are young don't realize it, but we didn't have outdoor cafes. It was not till the Lindsay administration that we started to have outdoor cafes. There was only 3 in the entire city. So they couldn't afford to eat out, but on Sunday, they went to the Brevoort Hotel, and they were so poor, they combined breakfast with lunch. They got there late, and one day they were eating, and Sinclair Lewis stopped and he said, "You know what this is? Brunch." And that's where the word brunch comes from. I'm finished.
Thank you. Dave Simpkins is the editor and publisher of the Sauk Center Herald, situated, not surprisingly, on Sinclair Lewis Boulevard in Sauk Center, Minnesota. He's also the editor of the magazine Minnesota Trails, has served on the Sauk Center Park Board, he has served on the Sauk Center Park Board, the Stearns County Park Board, and the Lake Wobegon Trail Association. He's currently writing a book about the young Sinclair Lewis and the influence that Sauk Center, Yale University, and New York City had on him and his writings. Thank you for coming this very long distance to share your scholarship with us. May I introduce Dave Simpkins.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Interesting thing, we're staying about 6 blocks from here, and last night I had a dream that I spent the day with Sinclair Lewis. So if you feel a certain presence today, you know, that might be part of that dream, I don't know. But yes, I've been the editor of the Sauk Center Herald for 26 years, and the first story I wrote when I arrived at Sauk Center was about the Sinclair Lewis boyhood home. And I've given many tours of that home, and I know it very well. And just last year, we put a medallion on our own wall as part of the Minnesota Historical Society and the Minnesota Literary Association. Felt it would be a good tourist spot. You know, I think this idea of putting medallions and identifying historic places is very vital. It's vital to history and to passing the message along, which is what Sinclair Lewis was great at. I mean, I just love reading Sinclair Lewis because so much history comes out of it. You know, back home in Sauk Center, you know, he wrote about, you know, the telephone wires cracking when he walked down the street, and he gave some just gory details of the grimy-looking butcher shops. But also he had some nice fine details of how the women dressed and how they decorated their homes. And when he came here, when he was living here, and he started to write, he started talking about life in New York City, the Italian flower salespeople, and also interesting enough about the landladies in the different rooming houses that people lived in and so forth. And he also wrote about the suffrage movement, which kind of occurred in this area. He called himself a suffragette. You know, and we're taking a walking tour tomorrow, and I want to learn a little bit more about that suffrage movement and how that came about and how it went. But as you can see, I think Lewis was a historical writer. He gave us a good feel for what was happening back then. And likewise, this Medallion movement, identifying these great places, will let further generations come here and get a feel for this place and the people that were here, and hopefully learn more about what they stood for and what wisdom they had to pass on to us all. So I'm really glad for this opportunity. I want to thank the homeowner and the association for bringing us all together and just sort of continuing the beat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Sally Parry is the Executive Director of the Sinclair Lewis Society and Associate Dean for Academic Programs and Student Affairs. She teaches literature at the Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois. She's lectured and written extensively on Sinclair Lewis, and in 2005 edited 2 volumes on his writings, Go East, Young Man, Sinclair Lewis on Class in America, and the Minnesota Stories of Sinclair Lewis. She joins us today all the way from Normal, Illinois, and we thank her for being with us.
Thank you. And it's wonderful to be here, and thanks to George for opening his home to us. When Lewis moved here in the fall of 1910, he was an enthusiastic and driven young man, anxious to make his mark on the world, but still not really sure how. He had a bachelor's degree from Yale, had done odd jobs for Upton Sinclair at Helicon Hall in New Jersey, and had traveled twice to England working on a cattle boat, once to Panama for adventure and to learn some Spanish. He had published a few things, some poems, including children's verse, a couple of short stories, and some translations from the French and German for the American publication Transatlantic Tales. The years between finishing his degree and moving to New York are summarized by biographer Mark Schorer as a miscellany of false starts, lost jobs, loose ends, and erratic wandering. He had been a newspaper reporter, although rather unsuccessfully, worked as a part-time secretary in California, and sold plots to author Jack London. In October 1910, he started working as a manuscript reader for the publishing firm of Frederick A. Stokes and Company, a job that brought him to New York and put him in contact not only with the publishing world, but also with many of the rising intellectuals of the time. Novelist Floyd Dell, dramatist Susan Glaspell, civic reformer Francis Perkins, and the social revolutionaries John Reed and Louise Bryant. Lewis joined the Socialist Party, attended the anarchist ball, and supported women's suffrage. And although he wasn't a strong supporter of political causes, he was interested in social justice and the desire for America to live up to the ideals on which it was founded. While at Charles Street, which was Van Ness Place at the time, he wrote Hike in the Airplane, a boy's adventure story under the pseudonym of Tom Graham, and sold it to his employer, the Stokes Company. The terms were such that he was able to take a 2-month leave in order to start work on Our Mr. Wren, The Romantic Adventures of a Gentle Man, his first adult novel, and the first under his own name. Our Mr. Wren shows much of the writing style that Lewis would develop in his later novels, such as the details that Dave was talking about, including walking down the streets in Greenwich Village. In Lewis's writing, it is evident that he paid real attention to the way that people spoke and what and how they thought. Bill Wren is in many ways a stand-in for the young Sinclair Lewis of Sauk Center, Minnesota, who romanticized far-off places and eventually traveled to some of them. When Lewis left the village, he married and moved to Long Island, but the intellectual ferment and the ideas about social reform that he encountered here affected much of his later writing. A novel later in the same decade, The Job, provided a sympathetic but not sentimental look at the women who were becoming increasingly important in offices across the city. He is celebrated for his magnificent novels of the 1920s. Main Street, which showed both the good and bad sides of small-town life and made him a best-selling author. Babbitt, a somewhat sympathetic picture of an American businessman. The Pulitzer Prize winning Aerosmith, which is still cited by doctors as inspiring, the very relevant Elmer Gantry, an expose of pernicious evangelism, and Dodsworth, which presented the American businessman in Europe, all of which gave rise to E.M. Forster's oft-quoted statement that Lewis was able to, quote, lodge a piece of the continent in our imagination. Lewis, although he is popularly thought of as a cynic and satirist, also loved the America he wrote about. But as he later told literary critic Perry Miller, I don't like it. The dissonance between what the United States stood for and what actually happened turned him into a disappointed Democrat, as his second wife, the journalist Dorothy Thompson, noted. This ambivalent attitude towards his country is evident in much of his writing, from the very beginnings to the warnings against fascism in the 1930s and It Can't Happen Here, and the explosive expose of racism in the post-war Kingsblood Royal. In an obituary, Donald J. Adams observed, both in his life and in his work, he was American. So many of our national characteristics were magnificent in him. Our restlessness, our energy, our impatience, our quick friendliness, our idealism. He was bone of our bone. But I'll leave the final words to my friend Richard Lingaman, who said, his fiction functioned at its highest pitch when galvanized by anger at some banality or stupidity or injustice. His iconoclasm chimed with America's coming of age after World War I, but he wrote with a real moral passion. He really cared. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perry, for that scholarly and informative description of the life and times of Sinclair Lewis. I wonder if you would give another fact
Sure.
to this assembled group.
Sure.
You refer to him as the Pulitzer Prize winning, and
Yes.
Therein lies quite a tale.
It does.
Because he is a man who rejected the Pulitzer Prize twice. Would you like to share the details?
I would love to. Actually, he was actually chosen by the Pulitzer Prize committee for both Main Street and Babbitt. The trustees of Columbia decided that his work did not show the best side of America, so he was passed over, and the Pulitzers in those 2 years went to Willa Cather and to Edith Wharton. So in 1925, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Aerosmith, a novel that's still very, very popular about the rise of a young doctor and trying to balance research with actual medical practice. He turned it down. He said he didn't believe in contests for writers. As a cynic, some people said that, at the time one got about $1,000 for the Pulitzer Prize. Some people said he got more publicity out of turning down the Pulitzer Prize than he would have for accepting it. I still think of him as the Pulitzer Prize winning author because he's still listed that way, but I think by the time the Nobel Prize came around, he decided that contests for authors were okay.
Thank you. I thought you'd all be interested in that little sidebar. Sally Perry, obviously a noted scholar, thought well enough of Richard Lingaman to use the last paragraph of her remarks, quoting him directly. Now you're going to get the real thing. May I introduce you to Richard Lingaman, the award-winning biographer, historian, editor, journalist, and satirist. Like Lewis, Mr. Lingaman grew up in a small Midwestern town. After serving in the Korean War, he entered Yale Law School for 1 year, and then found his calling as a writer and editor. A freelancer for the New York Times Magazine and Book Review, in 1969, he joined the Times Book Review staff and later became executive editor of The Nation from 1978 for nearly 20 years to 1996. Mr. Lingaman's definitive biography, Sinclair Lewis, Rebel from Main Street, was published by Random House in 2002. His most recent work is The Noir 40s, published in November 2012. It is a real pleasure to introduce Richard Lingaman.
Thank you, Barbaralee. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, George, for opening his house. I'm a great fan of authors' houses, and I always get a little creepy feeling down my spine when I go in there. Wow, someone slept here. But anyway, Harry Lewis was born in Sauk Center, Minnesota. Sinclair Lewis, the world-famous author, was born here in New York City. He came to the city in 1910, another unknown young man from the provinces, burning to be a writer. So it's fitting that the Landmark Alliance commemorate the first place he lived when he arrived in this great international city. In September 1910, Lewis, barely 2 years out of Yale, sent a letter to his father asking to borrow $300 so that he could move to New York. At the time, he was living in Washington, working on a magazine, actually a magazine for deaf people, which was edited by a college friend who had given him the job. Before that, he had been bumming about the country, ending up in California, where he held and lost several jobs. His future did not look too promising. In the letter to his father, Lewis said that he needed to come to New York to meet editors, to see if there was a future for him in the writing game. He could live here on $50 a month, he said, if after 6 months he didn't make a strike, as he put it, he would get a full-time job. Lewis's father, Dr. E.J. Lewis, country doctor, was a frugal man. He had loaned Harry money to finance a previous foray into New York. That incursion came about after Lewis impulsively dropped out of Yale. He lived here a while, shared a shabby room with a friend, sending out poems and stories to magazines with little success. Defeated, he returned to Yale and finished his final year. So when he asked for another loan, Doc Lewis, dubious about his prospects, turned him down. But Lewis, as a sign of his great determination, came to New York anyway and took a job with a publisher where another classmate, his father owned his publishing house, Stokes. He'd probably heard about this place from the two college classmates already living here. He held the publishing job for several years, but kept writing in his spare time. He began selling short stories to the high-paying Saturday Evening Post. When he moved to Long Island with his new wife, Grace, a smart, stylish young woman who worked for Vogue, he rode on the train, commuting to work every day. That way he finished his first novel, Our Mr. Wren. It was set in the city, and possibly Lewis's room here at 69 Charles Street was like the one his hero, William Wren, lived in. Quote, an abjectly respectable room, the bedspread patched, no two pieces of furniture from the same family, pictures from the magazines pinned on the wall. Lewis went on to publish more novels. One of them, The Job, was a realistic study of working women in New York. The heroine's career was partly based on Grace's experiences working in Vogue as an editor. But all the while, he never gave up his real dream, which was to write a big and true novel inspired by his hometown. He already had the title, Main Street. In 1915, he quit his publishing job and became a full-time writer. To research the big novel, he and Gracie toured the country in a Model T Ford, accumulating notes on the look and feel of the dusty, dozing little towns of his own Middle West. Finally, he was ready. In 1919, he and Gracie settled in Washington. It was a quieter town than New York. They thought it was too frenetic here. Writing steadily through the hot summer of 1920, he finished Main Street. When it appeared that fall, it caused a sensation. It touched the hearts and minds of many people. Probably like the young people who had come to the New York like himself, seeking opportunities commensurate with their ambitions. It could be said that Sinclair Lewis had to come to New York in order to write a novel about small towns. Main Street got the whole country talking. It opened up the subject of provincialism, conformity, cultural poverty out in the middle America. Eventually, it got the world talking. People in other countries were curious about America, which had emerged from the First World War as an economic power. Main Street was their first glimpse of the real America, its people, its towns and farms and factories. In subsequent novels during the 1920s, Babbitt, Aerosmith, Elmer Gantry, Lewis gave the world more vivid pictures of his country. In 1930, the Swedish Academy had confirmed his international stature when it awarded him the Nobel Prize. Okay, back in 1910, when he was pleading with his father for that loan to finance his move to New York, Lewis told him that his only ambition was to be a writer. He vowed that he was, quote, going to go on working toward the end of getting to be a really great writer. He predicted that one day his father would be proud to, quote, see me as a sizable writer, one whose books everyone must know. His prophecy came true, and it was in this house he started that first leg of his momentous literary journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for your knowing and scholarly and interesting presentation. We're privileged to hear from all of our speakers this morning and their thoughtfulness. A question for you. Do you have anything to substantiate Mr. Caps's claim that Stephen Vincent Benet and others lived here? Is there any anecdotal material that
Yes,
reveals that?
I've read it. Yeah, William Rose Benet.
Who was it?
But,
Who did live with him here?
yeah, William Rose Benet lived here, and oh God, I've drawn in the blood. It wasn't
Was it Ellen Updegraff?
Updegraff. I'm thinking Updegraff. Alan Updegraff was one of his few friends at Yale. And they had already gone off adventuring, and I think they lived here, and they found this as a cheap place. But William Rose Benet, he had been to California with him. They were close friends too, and they were both Yale classmates. Yeah. And also not mentioned was living here was Harry Kemp, who was known as the tramp poet. And he wrote a book called Tramping on Life, his biography, and he remembered Lewis. He didn't like Lewis much, and they didn't get along very well. But he was known as a hobo poet. He would go around and reading poems for people and getting handouts. But he was another notable person who lived here. We mustn't forget Harry Kemp, who was a village character.
Thank you. And in addition to these three scholars, an appreciation of Sinclair Lewis was written by the noted writer and professor, author of If I Were Boss, The Early Business Stories of Sinclair Lewis, Professor Anthony D. Renzo of Ithaca College, who could not be with us, and we asked him to write an appreciation. And I think you will find his elegant prose of genuine interest. It will be read by Deborah Burchad, who is the project director of the New York City Landmarks 50 Alliance. Deborah.
Thank you, Barbaralee. Whenever another Wall Street crook beats the rap, another overpaid CEO cuts benefits, or another business guru writes a bestseller, I shake my head and sigh, Lewis, thou shouldst be living at this hour. America hath need of thee. No other American humorist, not even Mark Twain, remains more relevant or better deserves to be commemorated in a cultural medallion. Sinclair Lewis was the Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert of his day, but he was as much a prophet as a satirist. Long before the Roaring '80s, Lewis foresaw America's revolution by rotary and its corrosive impact on our nation's politics and institutions. Like Daniel in Babylon, he dreamed of the beasts of the sea, hustling realtors and housing bubbles, big pharma and junk science, corporate philanthropies and profitable diploma mills, televangelism and prosperity theology, the corruption of the U.S. auto industry, and the McDonaldization of the world. Perhaps if we had paid more attention to the man from Main Street, the men from K Street might not have won. But by honoring Sinclair Lewis, we can encourage young Americans to rediscover his work and to recover the heartland populism he promoted and defended. For certain network pundits, populism is a sneer against the poor and the weak. For Lewis, it is a horse laugh against the rich and the powerful. If you want to take back this county, he might chide. I think he meant country. If you want to take back this country, he might chide, don't wear powdered wigs and silk cravats. That's bunk. Instead, cultivate enough shrewdness to recognize stupidity and chicanery, and enough compassion to denounce cruelty and arrogance. My late father-in-law, God bless him, a traveling salesman who was born in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and raised in Fargo, North Dakota, left a Gideon Bible in every motel. Whenever I book a room, I leave behind a paperback edition of a Sinclair Lewis novel. This cultural medallion, however, is a more effective way to keep Lewis in circulation. I also suggest that the U.S. Mint stamp his face on a 5-cent piece. If the day ever comes when, through our own fault, this commercial democracy ain't worth a wooden nickel, Sinclair Lewis will still be the gold standard of American satire. Anthony DiRenzo, Department of Writing, Ithaca College.
Cultural medallions are porcelainized enamel plaques that were designed by the distinguished, award-winning international designer Massimo Vignella. They received the approval of 3 New York City commissions after a 2.5-year period, and only Mr. Capsis wanted to redesign it. However, we will affix today a standard New York City medallion that are affixed to the exterior of buildings throughout the city to commemorate an individual or an occurrence that has made a significant contribution to New York City's rich cultural heritage and create a sense of pride in our city and our history. Most of these people or events are nominated for inclusion by members of the public, as was the case today. There are approximately 100 cultural medallions in place throughout all of New York City. And to learn more about our programs and how you can nominate a worthy, please see our website, HLPC culturalmedallions.org. It is a pleasure to dedicate this cultural medallion to the accomplishments of Sinclair Lewis. It is a privilege to have had these very distinguished scholars travel near and far and share their informed thoughts, and you, the audience, as well. And now Simeon Bankoff will unveil and read the text of the cultural medallion.
Sinclair Lewis, February 7th, 1885 to January 10th, 1951, 69 Charles Street, Manhattan. The first U.S. writer to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature, 1930, novelist and short story writer Sinclair Lewis, born in Sauk Center, Minnesota, was a graduate of Yale University. His earliest published work was in the Yale Literary Magazine, where he became an editor. After college, he apprenticed as a journalist and writer of short stories and lived here from 1910 to 1913 while working at New York publishing houses as a copywriter and editor. After 1916, he began work on a realistic novel criticizing small-town conformity that became the bestseller Main Street, 1920, following that 2 years later with Babbitt, a satire of middle-class boosterism set in the Midwest. Several of Lewis's novels were adapted for the movies, including Aerosmith, 1925, for which he won, but turned down a Pulitzer Prize, Elmer Gantry, 1927, and Dodsworth, 1929, also a Broadway play. Lewis wrote 11 more novels after his Nobel Prize, most notoriously It Can't Happen Here, 1936, which envisioned fascism coming to America. It was staged nationally by the Federal Theater. Lewis died in Italy in 1951.
Thank you, Simeon. Thanks to each and all of you for joining us today, here where history happened. I know there are many members of the Sinclair Lewis Society present, and they would like to be photographed, I hope, with our distinguished guests in front of the medallion. So if we can just take this away, we will invite you to come forward. Thank you all again.